Hello there folks, I'm back again with another speed paint for you guys, and this is the finale of my Halloween themed speed paints for the month of October. And I'm actually going to do an art challenge that other people are doing, which is 2024's Art Fright. I'm actually recording this quite early into October, so I don't know how many other people are doing this challenge. I haven't seen any other posts about it, but I thought it would be fun to do something that other artists had the opportunity to do, and not just silly things that I made up for myself. Today, I am doing 3 illustrations based on the Art Fright team's prompts for their challenge Art Fright, which is a Halloween-themed art challenge. So, I'll be doing 3 prompts and using 3 of their color palettes for the challenge. So, I hope you guys enjoy. I had a lot of fun with this challenge. The first prompt that I chose was Howl, and I used the color palette Dying Embers for it. Now, it's been a little bit since I've done limited color palette art, and I always find it a lot of fun to do. It seems to be very hit or miss among artists on the internet. It seems like either people really love doing it, or other people have a lot of challenges trying to do this style of art. And I feel like what makes it easy for me is to help separate the colors into their values, and then that basically informs how we'll be using this in the piece. This piece isn't very conceptually crazy. I mean, it's just some wolves howling at the moon with a spirit on the moon as well. Mostly, this piece isn't really about its concept as much as it's about its composition. I just really wanted to have a nice, shadowy wolf in front of a nice, bright moon. And this color palette with its 2 hues really lends itself to that sort of composition. That, and I thought it would just be a simple, striking way to address the prompt of Howl. First, I sketched out the composition by making a nice little cliff and a little wolf to stand on with a moon put up behind him, and to fill out the bottom a little bit more, I gave him some friends as well. Then I filled in the wolves and the cliff and put down the moon. Honestly, this piece is extremely simple. I basically just did the character art and then the background art, and then I found myself tweaking what colors I used for each situation. I really wanted that contrast to be as high as possible for my focal point, being the shadowed wolf in front of the big full moon. So I did my best to make sure the moon looked as bright as possible and that my wolf looked as dark and in the shade as possible, with a nice little bright eye to break up the silhouette and make it look a little more distinctive. For the moon itself, I actually added the shadow of another wolf spirit to give a little bit more into the composition. I thought the moon looked a little too plain without enough texture, and I didn't want to have to go through and put a whole bunch of craters on it, since I didn't think that really added to the vibe of the howling. So I like to imagine that maybe in the world of this drawing, maybe there's like a wolf spirit who is guiding these 3 wolves and they're all following it on the moon. I don't know, I just thought it would be a lot of fun. For the bottom wolves, I decided to add some rim lighting. For the top, I added this sort of rim light around the edges on the layer, but it didn't really do the wolves that are on the bottom since they were inside the other shapes. So I gave them a nice red rim lighting to make them look a little bit more dramatically shaded, and to help pop them out against the dark background since they're basically drawn with the same few colors that the grass and the cliff is made out of. Overall, this was a pretty simple piece. I didn't strictly adhere to the color palettes. I used some different layer modes with the colors that were given, so it's not a strictly 5-color drawing like some people might have tackled for this challenge, but I thought it was a lot of fun to work with this sort of limited palette again, and I think even though this is a very simple piece, I think it's pretty effective. The next prompt that I tackled was Mask, and for this one I had another very strong idea in mind for what the composition would look like. I thought of this very early 20th century style illustration, and I really wanted to have a bat flying in front of a man's face, and I figured I would make that man slightly implied to be a vampire as well. After all, in addition to using the prompt Mask, I'm also using the color palette Vampire Masquerade, which is a nice muted color palette except for those beautiful, beautiful reds that are right smack dab in the middle of the values. I thought it would make a very striking image to have a mostly black and white sort of thing with a nice big red bat right in the middle, and I thought it'd be fun to draw a bat and to draw someone covered up by it, sort of Magritte painting style. Except I guess instead of a fruit, this is a flying creature. This was a pretty simple piece again, just like the other one. I really wanted it to be about the values, so it's a very low contrast sort of piece for the bat. It's a lot of mid-tones. You've got your mid-tone reds, all originally from the original palette. And then for the man in the background for my vampire, I had a little bit of challenges trying to figure out the colors I wanted for him. At first, I kind of wanted him to be totally grayscale, but I think that looked a little bit too weird, so I kind of went with the reds that were in the palette, but then I felt like he was blending into the bat too much. So to increase the contrast, I went with this sort of off-white, sort of pink color, this pinkish gray, and I thought that that would help strike a nice balance between looking cohesive with the rest of the piece, including the bat, while also looking extremely different from the bat in the foreground. I also gave a nice dramatic shadow to this entire piece. I really wanted it to look like it's under very stark, bright light, which I understand is a little bit antithetical to how vampires usually go. Usually they're not in bright light, but I just thought it would make the piece way too cool compositionally to pass up the opportunity. So I slapped a nice big shadow on the bat, and an even bigger, brighter shadow on the vampire man. I had a lot of fun with this piece. It was very, very simple, but it really challenged me to think about the composition, to think about the values, and to really think about how I wanted to make the image in my head become a reality. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. This one gave me a bit of a challenge, but I'm pretty happy with it. I like how I drew the bat. I think the male character in the background looks pretty good. And I think the values all turned out in the way exactly how I wanted, as far as the hierarchy of what stuff is in the image and what the viewer's eye is drawn to first. I had a lot of fun with this piece, and I hope you guys enjoy how it came out too. The last prompt that I decided to do was Eclipse, and the color palette that I decided to use for it was Foggy Forest. Unlike the other two drawings in this video, I actually really didn't have a great idea for the composition in this piece going in. In fact, I really barely had an idea for this piece going in. All I knew is that I wanted to use that dark off-black color in the palette to create a nice solar eclipse in the sky, and that was it. I was just gonna have to fly by the seat of my pants for the rest of the composition. The first thing I did was lay down a hill using a nice bunch of trees. I sketched them out, drew them, and then proceeded to use some tree brushes on them later on in the piece. I also wanted to keep that nice foggy, obscure vibe. I wanted it to look really spooky and like you can barely see what's going on. Have you ever woken up pretty early in the morning, right at sunrise, and it's been so foggy, so it's so bright, but you can like barely see a few feet in front of you? I really wanted to capture that sort of tranquil, mysterious vibe that fog really gives off, at least in my experience. So I want to keep this piece as foggy as possible, as the title of the color palette might suggest. So I used some trees, I gave some grass, and I put some plants in the foreground as well, to give this piece a little bit more balance, since the eclipse on its own would have easily made the composition feel lopsided. To balance out the piece, I decided to put a character in it, and for this I decided to put a somewhat spooky deer. I wanted him to look like a deer, recognizable as one, but to seem a little bit off. Like his antlers are a little strange, and his eyes are glowing, and something about him is just a little bit weird. That sort of vibe you get when you see an animal in the woods and you almost know what it is, but you can't quite lay a finger on what you think that animal is. Something about it just isn't right. I just wanted to have that sort of vibe where it's simultaneously just a little unsettling while primarily being peaceful. Honestly, this piece, more than anything else for me, was about the process. I had a lot of fun with all the layers in the background, trying to make a convincing sense of depth, trying to make sure everything was nice and balanced while also looking like it all goes together. I had a lot of fun with it. Perhaps my favorite part was this little bit at the end where I was handling the values and the shading. I felt like the whole piece looked a little bit too flat, so I decided to add a nice shading layer on top, where I basically put a whole shading thing on top of the whole piece and then slowly erased at it with these cloud brushes to give them more of a foggy vibe, as if you are literally peering through layers and layers of fog. So I basically erased around the eclipse, that way you could see that it was coming through and give it more contrast, and around the deer to make that guy a little bit easier to see as well. Overall, I think it really did a good job dimming down the piece and making the high contrast points, the character and the eclipse, a lot more easier to see, aside from all the other pieces that would have been otherwise way too similar of a value. So ultimately, this piece was more about vibes and the process and just going with the flow on where the process took me, more than anything else. Unlike the other two pieces, where I had a pretty strong idea of what they'd look like going in, this one pleasantly surprised me by the time I was finished. And with that, those are all of my Art Fright illustrations for 2024. Did you guys have a favorite? I think my favorite might honestly be the Eclipse piece. Even though I had the least idea going in, I really like how it came out and it was just so much fun to work on. If you have a favorite, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on these wonderful spooky drawings. And with that, that also means I'm done with my spooky drawings for the month of October. It was a lot of fun, but also a little bit restrictive, making myself settle down on a bit of a theme for the month. But the good news is that November is just around the corner, which means I'm going to be doing some regular old flying by the seat of my pants style prompts for the rest of the year. I'd actually like to hit 100 subscribers before the end of the year, so if you're interested in my art and like my art style, like hearing my process, or just like hearing me yap about colors and stuff, feel free to subscribe. I'd love to have you around, and I'd love to grow my little community here a little more. If you'd like to support me, I recommend checking out my Ko-fi page. It's the best way you can support me. I'm trying to see if I can get more monthly members since I'll be transitioning away from Patreon at the end of the year, so any support I can get there to get a little more attention, a little more followers there, would be really, really appreciated. And with that, that is all I have for you guys today. I hope to have another exciting speed paint for you guys next week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and in the meantime, go out there and make some art.